Okay, how is everybody today? Welcome. See, we've got about 30 or folks in with us so far, and a few more folks joining. So we're just going to give it a few more minutes to let folks join. But I hope everybody that's on so far was able to enjoy some of the music. And I would encourage you to go into the chat and just kind of tell us who you are and where you're from. If you're with a group, let us know that, and say hi to folks. And then feel free to use the chat too to just talk to each other if you want, anytime during the presentation. And then we will be encouraging you to enter any questions or comments that you have also in the chat. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to welcome everybody to the last of our 8 presentations in the environmental education series that we have been putting on for the last 8 weeks by renowned climate scientist, Dr. Tom English. And this one's entitled Fate or Choice, COVID-19 and Climate Change. So it's going to be a very fun session that's also going to be looking at what impact this whole crazy year that we've just all been through and are still going through has had, and also has had relative to climate change and any other interesting thoughts and musings that Tom may have for us. My name is Dave Rice, and I'll be your host for this event. If you have any questions or need help with anything during the presentation, just send me a private chat message down there at where you see the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. This has really been an enjoyable experience for me to be able to host these events for Tom. Dr. English has accomplished so many things in his rich and varied career, and much of it has had to do with improving our environment. Some of the highlights are he was the author of the California Clean Air Act back in the late 1980s, which was responsible for getting rid of all the smog that many of us who were here back then remembers, I'm sure. And, that's been a huge change in our lives just here in California. But he's also done so many things, far too many to name in an introduction. One that he particularly is fond of is receiving on behalf of the Patriarch Bartholomew on his work on climate, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he received a copy of that from the Patriarch for all their work here nationally and globally for that. And so, one of the things that I enjoy the most about Tom is his ability to communicate difficult concepts in very easy to understand ways. So he's got a huge passion for educating others on our current climate crisis and the existential threats that it's bringing to us and to our children's generations. So we all need to be aware of what can be done to counter this. And that's really the goal of this series, to help us all clearly better understand the main issues behind climate change and what can be done about it, so that we can have better discussions with family and friends when we're talking about these issues and try to make a difference. If you are new to Zoom, what I would encourage you to do is go up to the top right on your screen and just click on the View button up there and click on Speaker View. And that will give you the best viewing of the presentation and of the slides. We have temporarily disabled the video cameras and the microphones. We will have some question and answer sessions throughout the presentation. So as I said, I would encourage you to please enter your questions or comments into the chat. And during the breaks that we have for questions, we'll go ahead and get to as many of those as we can, and whatever's left over, we'll have at the end. And our final Q&A session, we'll go ahead and turn on the cameras and microphones for folks so everybody can see each other, say hi, and you can ask your questions live if you would like to. And we are pretty good about sticking around past time for folks that really have some interesting questions or want to have further discussion. So again, we would encourage you to do that. So again, welcome everybody. Thanks for being with us for all these sessions. I did also put in the chat that If you haven't been able to attend all the sessions, but you would like to receive a video copy of any of these, they are all recorded. Just send me an email. I put my email into the chat. It's daverice1@cox.net, and I'll be happy to send you the link to any of the sessions that you missed. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom English. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Dave. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks.
Let's see. Let's get into sharing the screen here.
Okay.
And there we go. And one more button. I think I'm starting to get this down.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, everybody. You can all see everything. Good. Well, welcome again. Thanks for the intro, Dave. This is a very interesting day. I really have a lot of fun getting these things together. This is a giant learning experience for me, and I hope it's a similar learning experience for you. The picture on the main slide here basically shows that in the USA we've had the sad situation of over 550,000 people have died from COVID-19 in a year. That's a incredibly high number. That's about as many as we lose to the number one death killer, cancer and heart disease. It's interesting, on the right side, we have a little snippet there that shows that the Russians back in 2010, a heat wave killed 55,000 people in the month of August. Now, you know, from our earlier lectures, we can predict a little bit about how often these things are going to happen in the future if we don't essentially shape up. And so what happens is the predictions are that we should be having deaths comparable to the COVID deaths sometime in the future. So we need to basically work to prevent that from happening. The title is an interesting one, I think. It's basically fate versus choice, applying that to COVID and climate change. Whenever we get these sort of situations like a COVID, a epidemic, a massive, or at least massive deaths inevitable, or could we have done better? Could we manage this better? Are we like ants on a log trying to steer the log? Or are we more like Lawrence of Arabia where nothing is written? So let's look at both COVID and the climate to help us make up our mind about what is our situation. First, we'll have an intro where we discuss some of the major ideas and some of the ideas we've had in the past. And then we look into COVID lessons, followed by climate lessons. And then basically we get into a thing where we pontificate a little bit here and try to decide what it is we've learned from all this work that we've done for the course. So that's the basic flow. So we'll start off with our introduction. This is a diagram of the number of daily cases of COVID in the US, going back to the February timeframe and extending to almost today. And what we see here is an interesting set of curves. There's a hump here, starts to go down a little bit, humps again, goes down a little bit, and then it goes up for a big hump. So this hump here was attributed to the holidays, the summer, people getting tired of all the restrictions and so forth. And so basically we essentially caused this second hump by our behavior. Also, there's a big fight on whether masks make any sense or not. And all this social distancing stuff, does it make any sense or doesn't it apply to us? And then what happened is we had a big peak here in Christmas time and Thanksgiving time, where again, we were doing all kinds of celebration and So what it shows is that the response to the virus depends very much on our behavior. So I guess the question is, can we control our behavior? And if we can, how can we do it? There have been problems with various institutions in the country. Food and Drug Administration has had some serious problems with the COVID problem. CDC has had a host of problems, and the problems never stop at the White House. So there's an awful lot of problems there. So we're going to talk about these three institutions and some of the problems they've had. And we can have some discussion as to about whether we could have done better with these folks. This gives you some idea of the unemployment situation. Basically, you can see the US unemployment was hanging around here, about 200,000 here, 200,000, so forth, nothing much happening. And all of a sudden, COVID struck and it soared upward, and it's been going down sort of steadily. But this is a giant impact on our whole economy, on our way of life. So this is one of those things that's a showstopper. So this is our COVID situation here, which is bad enough. And we're trying to get people to do all the right things, wash your hands and social distance, wear your mask and so forth, and everything will be well. That's our idea. But we have economic problems that are basically surfacing because of the COVID. And there's some problems with the way we do capitalism. Are we doing smart capitalism? Who knows? So we have to talk a little bit about that. And then if we solve these two problems, we have the giant problem of climate change kind of lurking in the background there. And that has a fairly short time fuse, the order of a decade or so, for us to get our act together in a big way. So the question is, are we up to that? We've seen some good progress with the organizational things like through the UN. They've had an incredible meeting in Paris for the Conference of Parties, COP21, where they adopted a plan for basically saving us from the climate situation. The plan was, we talked about it earlier. Whoops, hang on a second here. The plan just got lost. We'll get to that later in detail. How dangerous is COVID? When we say something like that, is well, how do you make a comparison? Well, what I did here is I took the data from the CDC data on the health data and the accident data for the US and took the top 10 and then superimposed on that the data from Johns Hopkins, which basically gives us the COVID data. So we'll take a look at that and we can see what we see here. We see that the number 10 and number 9 are suicide and nephritis, and they come in at about 50,000 cases a year of deaths. Then more in the middle, we see things are pretty close between stroke, chronic lower respiratory disease, unintentional injury, and also the COVID's up to, this is in August. And the COVIDs were predicted to get up to a much higher level here. And then we also have cancer, which we can see gets up to around 600,000 cases a year, and heart disease, which gets about 650 cases a year. So COVID even then looked pretty bad. But if you update the data for today, the projections are the following: that basically COVID is predicted right at the to be a tie with cancer essentially, and it may go beyond. So it's a very serious disease. The impact of COVID has been awesome in terms of debt. Our US debt is continuing to go up and pretty much a steady curve here. And then what happened is it kept going at the same rate, and all of a sudden COVID hit and there's a big spike in it. So it's been a very expensive thing. Hopefully we can get the economy back together with the current situation. Change of administration should be a big help. An interesting thing has occurred in this epidemic, in that masks, which are a piece of cloth essentially, have become a political statement. These basically are, it says here, a new symbol of tyranny. Can you imagine a mask as a symbol of tyranny? and people were picketing with big signs saying freedom, no lockdown, no masks, no tests. These are all considered to be infringements on personal freedoms. Well, I don't know whether they're more of an infringement or than things like having to have an airplane pilot's license when you fly an airplane, or a driver's license when you drive a car, or wearing a seatbelt. I think there's similar kinds of things that when you live in a large society, there are some restrictions that you have in order to function. So in order to understand some of this, I'd like to introduce you to a simulator. It's called What Happens Next? COVID-19 Futures. So if you put that into your browser, it'll get you to this here. This is a playable simulator. So as they say, the simulators are used by airplane pilots to keep from crashing. And this health simulator, this COVID simulator, is used to keep our civilization from crashing. So we'll go over this a little bit, and I think you'll find this to be interesting. These are the kind of things that the simulator has as variables. You can slide any of these variables from one extreme to another. This is your hygiene one, washing your hands, etc. This is your physical distancing one, 6 feet, etc. Here we have an idea that we haven't done very well in the country, isolating cases, where you basically find a case and then you make some tracing of the people that have been in touch with that case to make sure that the virus doesn't spread. Face masks, okay, lots of debate on face masks. The strength of summer, things are supposed to get better in the summer. And then finally, vaccination. So we appear to be doing a pretty good job of getting shots in the arm now. So what we'll do is we'll take you through some of this material here and give you an idea of just how to get a handle on this. I hope you have a lot of questions about this. So you're familiar with all these measures. You hear about them every day in the news. These are not new ideas. This is just a way of quantitating the ideas so that you can get some idea of, if you make face masks, if you double the amount of face masking, what does that do? If you do things like vaccinations, what does that do? What combination of these things is best? So we want to find out how effective we can be in protecting us from COVID. So that's the job of the simulator. So what we do is we fiddle with the controls until we arrive at a so-called virus reproduction number. It's given the symbol R. And if this letter R is less than 1, that's good. That means the virus can't reproduce so that it grows, it starts to shrink. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. If this reproduction number is greater than 1, what happens is a virus has a baby. In other words, it has 1 baby, 2 babies, 3 babies, whatever. And so if R would be 3, 1 virus would produce 3 baby viruses. And if you do that, you have each generation more and more and more viruses. So things are out of control in that kind of situation. And that's the definition of an epidemic. Now, if we get this reproduction number to where it's equal to 1, what happens is that we have basically the virus count stays the same. For every one born, there's a new one that dies. And so the total number of viruses is constant during an endemic. So that's what they mean when they say a virus is endemic in your society. And the good news is, if you get to a place where the virus reproduction number is less than 1, you have a certain number of viruses here. They're dying off. Basically, half of them die off when you get a new set of viruses. So you have one number here, half of that here, half of that there, and so forth. So this is where you're winning the game in terms of your control. So R is the one thing that's really critical in terms of understanding what you're doing. Otherwise, if you don't have some idea of R, you really don't know what you're doing in terms of your management techniques. So let's use the simulator. to see how effective our control measures could be. We start off with a typical number for the U.S. is when we started off in January of over a year ago, we had a R, a so-called R naught of about 2.5. So that meant you had a lot of extra viruses, giving more babies than you have viruses. And so what happened is over the few months here, it starts to, you don't see anything for a month and a half or so. Then it starts to catch up and it gets more and more, and it gets really big here in April. Now what happens here is we get to a plateau where the curve flattens out. It flattens out because we've reached a point where R is equal to 1. So in that place there, R is equal to 1, and we have what's called herd immunity. So we have herd immunity. Now we get it on the other side where R is less than 1, and what happens is the number of viruses starts to drop and drop and drop and drop until we get here to September or so, when we have very few viruses left, and we have R at the end of this curve here at about 0.26. So it's down by a factor of 10. So that's how you keep track of it, and that's what you can do. You want to have a curve that goes up and then down and gets to be close to 0. So that's the goal. Now what we have is something that looks different than that. We have a very sort of sad curve. Our curve basically starts out where we have a peak here at about 30,000 or so. It settles down a little bit here, plateaus, but doesn't go away. It stays pretty close to the peak. Then what happens is we get a second peak. This one's at about 60,000 here. And that one goes down a little bit, but doesn't even go down to where it was before. And then we have basically a third peak here, which basically gets us to a peak of about 250,000. So this is a situation where we've been out of control. Let's hope now that we're coming down here with the vaccines and so forth, that it actually makes a giant difference. The question that's on everyone's mind is what the vaccines will certainly help you, but then you're sort of coming up against these wild variants of virus. And these variants, some of them are considered to be more transmissible and also more dangerous than the other ones. So we're hoping that we get enough shots in the arm to basically keep riding this curve lower and lower. So we're now to the time for some questions. Are there any questions?
Sorry, Tom. Takes me a minute to unmute here on my other screen.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, there have been a couple comments. No real serious questions yet. Mark, I'm curious though. You had just mentioned that there was something in PBS last night about climate change, the facts, and extinction of the facts. That sounds pretty interesting. So maybe in the chat, you can put a little more information in there on that. I'd like to hear. Well, I see you're saying here is pretty depressing. You had to tune out after a while from it, but that sounds interesting. So if there's more info on it, channel 50 last night, PBS. Okay, great, interesting. Well, that'll be good. We'll have that in the chat. There are a couple questions though, Tom, that have come to me. So one is, why is there such a large disparity in the COVID-19 deaths per million population among various countries? What's behind that?
That's a great question, because we're near the top of the heap in terms of deaths per say million population. I think we're beaten by the United Kingdom and also Italy. I think we're third. So there's, and we're talking about the order of numbers like 1,000 deaths per million population. Whereas if you look at the bottom of the curve at countries like Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, those countries have more like 100 deaths per million population. So there's a factor of 10 difference between the death rate in the US and some of the more, what shall we call it, differently organized countries. Some people think that's due to the organization, like is the healthcare system socialized or not? I think that the United Kingdom kind of shows that that doesn't do everything, because they're the worst. So just doing one thing like that isn't going to save your bacon. It's got to be more deeper. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about some of that as we get on. But I think it's a wonderful question, and I think some of the talk will be we'll aim at answering that. So thanks.
Okay, and then Faye Lorraine is asking, are we already having climate change due to being at the end of an ice age?
Oh, certainly, yeah. An interesting thing is places like Sweden, for example, the land is still rising. So what's happening as the ice melts, the land rises as if it were on a spring instead of springing up. So yeah, some of the phenomena we're seeing is due to the idea of a normal kind of behavior in an ice age. But what's happening is we've basically blown the whole ice age criteria for the planet. Right now it's impossible for us to ever have an ice age again. We just can't do it because we have so much heat coming in that we basically won't have an ice age. So what we have to do if we want to get an ice age, we have to get around these numbers of 440 or so parts per million and get down to numbers that are more like 200 parts per million. Then you can have an ice age again, but that's going to be a while. So we have to solve the climate change problem first.
Okay, and then maybe last one for now is how do you see COVID-19 playing its role in the U.S. in the future? How long do you see it, becoming being a factor? What are you seeing there?
It's one of these things where the answer depends on us. It really depends on the choices we make. Like if we take this wave we're in now and we drive it down to very small numbers, okay, we'll get to the place where we don't need face masks, we don't need social isolation, we can hug and kiss each other again, that sort of thing. So, but on the other hand, if we get foolish again and basically say, I hate those face masks, I'm not going to pay any attention to those isolation requirements and not meeting with people and so forth, what will happen is we could basically have a serious wave, a fourth wave caused by these variants. So I don't know the answer. It really depends on folks like what you folks do and what you get your friends and neighbors to do. If we can tough it out for maybe another month or two, I think we can be in really great shape. Otherwise, Lord only knows, it might be something we just stay with for a long time.
Well, let's try one more related piece, which is about variants. And what do you see about the variants coming in? The question is, does our general complacency about COVID allow for the COVID variants to breed and foster? What's your take on those?
Well, what happens is you're going to have variants no matter what, okay? I mean, that's just the way these things work. So you're going to have variants. The question is, how many variants do you get? Now, that depends on how many viruses you have lurking around there. If you plateau the way we've been plateauing at a high number of cases per day, what happens is you just have an awful lot of viruses in your virus pool out there. And the more viruses you have in the pool, the more variants you're going to get. So if you don't want variants, what you want to do is to knock this thing down to some small number. And then what will happen to the variants? They have a tough time then. So that's the answer.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, a few more coming in, but let's go ahead and keep going, and then we can queue up some other questions in the future sessions here.
Okay. So let's go to climate here. I tried to put some lessons learned from the various classes. I thought it might be a good review for some of you before the final exam. Oh, by the way, next week, we are going to have a class. We're going to talk about the grid and how do you sensibly put renewables on the grid, and how do you adjust sort of the pricing of the grid so that you can get nice, so that the customers will basically use the electricity at the times when it's most profitable for them. So anyway, in this class, we basically talked about how humans are wired for quick response. If we see a rattlesnake, we do something quickly. We don't think about it and wonder what to do. We do it quickly. So we're wired that way, but we're not very well wired for long-term things. So that's a problem with the climate issue. It's a longer-term thing. Same problem with the epidemic issues. The epidemic we just had is like one in a century. So do we spend any money to prepare for that sort of thing? Or do we just hope it won't happen for a while? So we have to make a kind of decision as a society. So if we put a frog into hot water, here's what happens. It goes in the water and he pops right out, okay? So that's the quick response, and that's what we do, the quick response. Now, if you put a frog into cool water and gradually heat it up, he'll enjoy it and just stay there and get cooked. So that's the difference. So this is more like us. We basically, if we have a gradual problem, we don't like to respond. So what we have to do is sort of think it through a little bit and understand that we have to change our behavioral modes a little bit so that we can survive these kind of issues. In class number 2, we talked about how life functioned, and we showed how we're going through a fascinatingly complicated and threatening change of our whole ecosystem, where all of life, people, trees, killer whales, polar bears, elephants are going through a bottleneck, 21st century bottleneck. And a lot of them are becoming extinct. The extinction rate is bigger than anything we've seen on this planet for about 65 million years. So the big question for the 21st century is what's going to come out of this bottleneck? And again, same answer as before, it depends on us. If we function effectively, if we basically get our friends and neighbors to think their way through and to show some responsibility to basically the life on the planet, including us, things can work well. So we have a problem, as we mentioned before, with both the heat, that is the heat killing things, the climate change issue, and we also have a problem with the species. If we kill off enough species, say due to our land practices, what happens is you can make the situation so that we cannot thrive anymore. We're currently killing off about 8,000 species a year. That's roughly 1 species per hour. We compare that species kill rate with what's been normal for the last 600 million years, and you see we're about 32,000 times above the norm. So we really are behaving irresponsibly, and you can't keep this up for too much. It's sort of like cutting small cables on a hot air balloon. You can cut a few, but if you keep on cutting and cutting, pretty soon the hot air balloon doesn't function very well. So we have a problem, we have to solve it. This shows you a review of how we basically are part of food webs. This one is a harp seal, is the top level predator. We are the top level predator for the whole planet. This harp seal eats things that are below it in this chain here. These things in turn eat things at a lower feeding level, which eat things at a lower feeding level. And finally, it's all driven by phytoplankton, things that grow in sunlight. And so if you take any one of these out, nothing much happens usually, unless it's a keystone species. But if you take out half of these species, what happens is the efficiency of this whole web for processing sunlight energy and converting it into food becomes very inefficient. And this then threatens the number of top level predators you can have. And some of you may have guessed that the top level predator of the planet Earth is us. So we're number 1. And if we wreck our food web, you don't fix that on the weekend. So it will take a long, long time to recover, and we may not be part of the recovery. So again, we talked about the COP21 activities here. The basic idea is you got this agreement among all these nations. And what they agreed to is they agreed to try to keep the temperatures down to a rise of 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And with the goal also, if you can make it, of getting down to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically what's happened is the real agreement seems to have shifted to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have to get rid of all this carbon here in order to beat that goal. So that means we have to remove about 900 gigatons more of carbon dioxide. That's about 25 years of the current emissions. And we see that carbon dioxide has really grown roughly during the time of Lincoln and so forth. Wood was only used for keeping people warm at night. So that was our main carbon source. And then Watts came along in 1776 and invented the steam engine. The steam engine caused a lot of demand for things like coal, things that are have a high energy density. And we got on the way. Pretty soon coal was mixed with oil to be used, and oil became mixed with natural gas and so forth. And so this has been, the fossil fuels have been the things that have driven our economy for a long time. We looked at this book, Drawdown, to see what can be done about it by Paul Hawkins, and I recommend this highly to all of you. Can we achieve this 900 gigaton goal? And he says, yes, and you can also do that and save $74 trillion. That's a lot of money. So this gives you some examples of some of the things we've looked at, like using photovoltaics instead of fossil fuels. The cost benefit is really good. It's about 60 or so. And we've already installed the equivalent of about 350 centinovries in. So we're well on our way here, but we have to continue this kind of pace. In the book Drawdown, there's a spreadsheet that you can use, and this makes the calculations a lot easier. So what that shows that you can save an awful lot of carbon here, and you can save $74 trillion. And in the process of making those great savings, you can improve your whole economy, improve your quality of life, and also save the Earth as a habitable place for humanity. In class 3, we examined the ice data to go back in history to see how temperature has been on the planet for roughly the last million years or so. And what we see, it goes up and down from one of these peaks to another. That's an ice age, another ice age, another ice age, and so forth. So it goes high temperature, low temperature, a certain spread of temperature here. Human existence, you may recall, is roughly one ice age. So we've been around for basically one ice age. So we're a relatively new species on the block. This is another variable you can measure with the ice core data. This is the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And what we see here is that there's a fairly good correlation. It's not perfect, but it's a very decent correlation. This is a high peak here, high peak there. There are some other things that need to be added to it to get better data. Like, for example, this just looks at the CO2 equivalents. But basically, the lesson of this curve here is that the planet, for about 3 million years, it turns out, has been operating between roughly 300 parts per million and 200 parts per million. So as long as it stays within those bounds of carbon dioxide equivalent, what happens is it puts in the safety zone. Now, what we've done is we've gotten out of the bounds, and we're basically up here. So a person like Roger Revelle says to us, good luck, I wish you well, while you're doing this uncontrolled global experiment. Hope it works out for you. Well, it can't work out in the long run very well because we're way out of the bounds that the Earth system is set up for. Now, we've had systems like this in the past, but they're not really suited for humans. We had other critters that don't look like us, like dinosaurs. And if we continue our current trends and don't shape up, about 40 more years, what we'll find out is we're even further above this safety zone. So we have to basically fix the problem. It's simple. It's basically one of those interesting problems that if you fix it right, you can basically do it where you actually save money while doing it and improve your quality of life. If you don't do it, what happens is you you basically degrade your quality of life and threaten your future existence. Here's some examples of the kind of things that happen. As things warm up, what happens is you get more water vapor in the air. And as you get more water vapor in the air, what that does is causes essentially more storms. Some of the storms are normal storms, some are bigger, like this is Hurricane Sandy. We usually measure a hurricane by the velocity that we find flying through the hurricane. And we take that number as indicating the energy of the hurricane. It's not a very good figure. What we should do is you can measure that, but you should also measure the extent of the hurricane so you have some idea of the total energy in it. So the amount of total energy in these hurricanes has gotten up significantly, and so the damage can get up significantly. This is a fascinating picture. This is a guy scuba diving at in the New York subway system. It got all flooded. So the flooding was very severe. It's very expensive. And what happens is you can afford to be flooded once in a while, but you can't afford to be flooded too often. So if you're flooded too often, what happens is you cannot afford to fix up and repair the damage done. So if that happens, and if it's severe enough, you get into the situation where you will have to start abandoning cities that are really flood prone. Now, the risk of Hurricane Sandy has been changing over time. Back in 1880, the risk of a hurricane like that was basically 1 in 500 years. By the year 2017, what would happen is we heated up the planet enough where that risk increased to 1 hurricane like that in 25 years. And if we go out to the time frame of 2030 to 2045, we find that you have a risk of one of those 1 in 5 years. So basically between 2030 and 2045, comparing that with 1880, it's increased by a factor of 100. So our whole weather system is really changing very rapidly. And you've noticed that, and we talked about that in some detail in Weird Weather. We've seen where the churches, for example, as an organization, can make a giant difference in people's behavior. These are some classes that were put on by the climate crisis by a group called the Synod of Southern California and Hawaii. And hopefully they're going to continue in their efforts here. We mentioned this here as another example. This is the churches getting involved with the nuclear arms freeze in the 1980 period. And this was a meeting. This is a simulated picture. I don't have any pictures of the real thing. I lost them. This is a simulated picture. We had about 105,000 people in the Rose Bowl there. Thing was packed, and it was an all-day event. Big help. So that led to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which we now have. So, okay, we have some time for some more questions now.
Okay. Very good. So here's one that I think is really relevant, and that is, what is the main risk to successfully solving the climate crisis? What's our main risk?
Well, what elements could there be in solving? You know, you need to have technology to replace fossil fuels. We have enough technology today to do it. And if we start doing it in a big way, we'll develop even more technology. So our problem is not technology. Do we have enough capability to do all this in the time frame needed? Well, we went through some examples of how rapid things like cell phones came on, how rapid electric vehicles are coming on, and so forth. So we see that if the society wants to do something that's important to them, we can do it. So I think the answer is, the key question is, do we have the desire, do we have the political will to implement this? Because it'll take some changes in how we do things. We'll basically be all driving around electric cars. So I love my electric car, but you know, some of you probably haven't driven one yet, so it'd be a good thing to try. If we're going to be more effective in terms of housing, we need to figure out some way to have ways for people to get from where they're housed to work. So we need effective mass transit systems. Now that can be done. It's been done at the major cities, New York, Boston, Washington, Moscow, Stockholm, et cetera. So those things can be done. It's just a matter of doing them. Do we have, again, the initiative to want to do it? And I don't really know the answer, but I do know that I'm working as hard as I can to try to convince as many people as I can to basically do the right things so that we have a future for us.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, the point and the intent of this whole series, right, is to try to help get us more educated and more motivated to try to get there. I know that one thing I know we've talked about is potentially some other sessions downstream addressing sort of some of those more practical type things that people might be able to do to have an impact. So yeah, that's all, I guess, a possibility, right, in the future.
Yeah, it's all there. And one thing that you can do, you all can influence things by, sending us notes that basically say what kind of things you'd like to see. So what we'll do is take a look at your requests and see if we can, if we know enough about things to be able to put something together that's helpful for you. And it's really helpful to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So a couple good questions here. Mark is asking about the CO2 tipping point. And what is that tipping point where anti-warming measures won't matter? He followed that organization 350.org a while ago, and he believes they took their title from the supposed CO2 tipping point rate, irreversible climate change, and now we're past 400. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think that Bill McKibben made a good choice. It just turned out that he was a little optimistic,
Yeah.
and things weren't able to go that way. I would have thought we would have been in a much better situation by now, but we basically had giant political problems in this country that basically have gotten in the way of progress. Having presidents that say things like climate change is a hoax doesn't help you. So a lot of people believe whatever the president says, and if you hear things like that, that makes it harder to get people on board. But I think what's happening is the experience people are having is that, yeah, these things that people have been talking about happening are happening. So it's no longer a question of when it's happening now. And the question now is how much is it happening? And it's getting more and more. The fires, the crazy weather, the dying of forests, the spreading of disease. Disease is spreading much more easily. So there's a lot of indicators that basically tell us that, hey, things are different. I'll give you one indicator that I think is a cute one. When I lived in New York, we lived near a lake called Mohansic Lake, like, the last of the Mohicans. So Mohansic Lake was, they used to race cars on that in the winter. The lake would freeze over and you could have a couple of feet of ice there and the cars could race on it. Nowadays, you have no car racing at Lake Mohansic. So things are changing rapidly.
It kind of ties to another question that Mark had earlier, just about, why have there been any studies done that you're aware of, like psychological studies on why it is that wealthy people, corporations don't seem to care about the future? Why are they resistant? Why so much resistance to our reality of where we're at today, do you think?
I think what happens is they don't get enough feedback. I think if you go to any corporation with significant feedback, they change behavior. Now, there are different ways to feedback. Like, for example, the Germans didn't like all the packaging material that they were getting on when they went to the stores. And they protested and protested for years, and they were ignored. So what they did is they decided they would open the boxes in the store, take the stuff out of the boxes, and then throw the box on the floor. So that made an immediate change in the behavior of the companies. Now, in some situations, the feedback is positive. For example, like whenever we drink a bottle, a can of beer, okay, that can gets recycled at a high level, the order of 90% or so. Whereas if we have plastic, our plastics get recycled at a rate of somewhere closer to 10%. So what happened is there's just not enough pushback by us, on these companies to get their attention. If you basically do something that threatens their bottom line, what happens is you'll get instant attention.
All right, and one more for now, and that's Faye Lorraine asking, do solar flares factor into climate change over time?
Certainly, yeah. Solar flares are important. Volcanoes, every once in a while, something will go burp like Pinatuba. Krakatoa was made sensational sunlights for years, sunsets for years. So yeah, those are important factors. And so what you need to do is you need to factor those into your calculations. And there used to be big arguments over that. So what happened is a bunch of scientists got together and they basically put together the various sources of emissions, including volcanoes and solar flares and so forth. And they put those and compared them with the emissions from human beings. And it turned out that the natural emissions, from the solar flares, from the volcanoes, were swamped on the average by the emissions from humans. So it's like Pogo says, we have met the enemy and the enemy is us.
Well, there's some more good questions coming in, and continue to encourage everybody to submit those. I think we'll go ahead and move on to our, this is our final segment, and then we'll go into an extended Q&A session, I believe, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great.
Okay. So the question here is, what have we learned? And that's always a question of any kind of experience in life. What have you learned from it? So let's go over that. What we see is basically us as like a scuba diver threatened by looks like a big shark to us, COVID-19. And behind that big shark is a second big shark called the economic crisis. And we can basically stun that shark so it's not effective, or we can basically be ineffective and let that shark ruin us. And then underneath that one is a giant shark called climate change. So those are the issues. We have to solve all of those issues. So welcome to the problem solving club. Well, if you look at the COVID data for various countries, what you see is you can sort it out in different ways. I've basically lumped together categories. So these are countries here who have typically 1,000 deaths per million population. UK, Italy, US is third, Spain, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, France, Sweden, Austria. There's some similarities among those countries and some differences. Like, for example, UK, as I mentioned earlier, is a socialistic medicine kind of thing. The US certainly doesn't. We have the best medical techniques in the world. We just don't have much of a system for getting that out to all the people. So we have to somehow figure out how to do both things. Then you see people in the middle here, Ireland and so forth, Greece, Israel, Russia. And down the bottom here, we have a group where we are talking about 100 deaths per million. So this is a factor of 10 less in terms of deaths per million. Egypt, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, Vietnam. So what is the difference between this group here in yellow and this group down here in green? I think that's an important question, because somehow or other, these people are getting much smaller death rates than we are. And we need to understand that. So we have to basically find out what we've learned from COVID that will help us do better with climate. So hopefully there are some things we have learned, and so we can do better. Last Sunday, I believe it was, there was a video that I thought was really good on CNN. It's called The COVID War. And the subtitle is The Pandemic Doctors Speak Out. These are the guys who we've all seen on TV time and time again at these COVID task force meetings. And they're the ones that became very famous. We all know them. So what have we learned from that? There have been some institutional problems at the Food and Drug Administration, for example. It's headed by Stephen Hahn. He's the director of the Food and Drug Administration, and he's had some serious problems. For example, there was a drug that the president was touting, the president being an expert in many things, including medicine. He basically came up with this drug called hydroxychloroquine, an unpronounceable drug. And he basically touted it very much, put pressure on this guy, Hahn, and he basically, he doesn't say he succumbed to the pressure, but he does say it influenced him. They approved this drug for COVID. And then what they did is they actually did some studies to see whether it made any sense. And 2 months later, they disapproved it. Now, this kind of behavior by a trusted organization causes distrust of the organization. It makes you think that everything is not scientific, because these guys, they basically saying they're doing the science, that it's basically driven by politics. So it's a really limiting kind of thing. It's one of the things I think that has dramatically harmed the progress we made in the US in the COVID fight. Similarly, at CDC. CDC was a legendary place where they just thought they could do no harm. They're really a smart bunch of people, and they know how to take care of all these epidemics. They've been doing that for many, many years. What happened there is this director had a problem, Robert Redford. He had several problems. We'll talk about those. CDC at first recommended against face masks. What the argument was is that you don't need them. You folks in the general population don't need them, especially since the folks in the healthcare workers need them desperately. There's a giant shortage. So you don't need to wear face masks. You people out in the ordinary citizens. So we basically never had an effort where you would do something like having a bunch of people make face masks. At Wesley Palms here, my wife was involved in a group that basically made a lot of face masks for people. If we would have done that nationwide, we could have had basically people feeling good about what they were doing and just generated one heck of a lot of face masks. So anyway, CDC fought against the face mask at the beginning for ordinary people, and then a couple of months later endorsed them. So this again says, well, can we trust CDC? So there's a lot of distrust with the federal government because of this kind of reversal here. Redfield claims that his boss, Alex Azar, who's the director of the health and security area, wanted him to change the data in their prize publication, the Morbidity and Morality Weekly Report. And he says he was basically beat up by those folks several times. And what had happened is he finally, at the end of, near the end of his term, he had a discussion with them, and they were basically going on haranguing him for over an hour. And he said, look, if you guys want to fire me, you can fire me, but I am not going to change that report. Anyway, this is all denied by his boss. So again, it's an organization that was very, very highly trusted, and now it's somewhat suspect. And institutional problems in the White House, we've had a bunch of those. This is an interesting person here, Dr. Deborah Birx. She was the person that was brought in as the White House COVID response coordinator. So you've seen her on television many times. She is a fascinating person, and I think that this TV show has sort of given me a lot more sympathy for her position. She basically came in the job, had an office in the White House, and found out after a week or so that no one was much interested in her ideas. She had little access with the president for a week or so, but then she had essentially no access to the president. So the issue for her is, do you stay or do you leave? And she decided to stay because she wanted to have access to the governor. She was not permitted to make the kind of speeches she wanted to make on national TV, but she was allowed to make those speeches to the governors when she visited them. So it was a very fascinating situation. So she was one frustrated lady. She comments in this interview that during the first surge, there were about 100,000 deaths. And she says, then we had other surges that followed that. All of the deaths in the other surges could have been mitigated. That's a shocking statement. That means an awful lot of people died needlessly. So that takes courage to make a comment like that. This is the current director of CDC, basically looking at the death curve here. This is the initial curve back in May of 2020. And it gets up to a peak of deaths here. This is the second curve here. Notice the deaths are a lot less in the second curve. The reason they're less is because we got smarter in the hospitals and learned how to treat people better so that people didn't die. So even though the caseload was higher, we basically treated the people better. But that didn't work for the third curve here. So that's kind of the system that we have. We're going worse, and hopefully we're not going to get worse again. This is a source of data from the so-called Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. This is an outfit from Washington University that's funded by Bill Gates. Their death data is pretty current, March 25th, 2021. So basically they're projecting that we'll have somewhere around 600,000 deaths in the US, which is a real tragedy. 195 deaths they're projecting by July 1st. So if we look at this data and we say all these deaths going back to the first surge here were avoidable, basically the US has had more than 400,000 avoidable deaths. So this is a national tragedy, killing these many people for just not being able to manage the situation right. This is Donald Trump, former president of the United States, making some comments in early February of 2020. He was asked about wearing a mask. He says, I don't think I'm ever going to wear it. Maybe they're great, or just good, or maybe they're not so good. This is the president making comments on a brand new program where the CDC is trying to make up for its past mistakes on the mask. And he's basically saying, I'm not going to have a mask. And according to Deborah Birx, almost no one in the White House wore masks. There's a lot of social pressure against masks, even when people had COVID. The president was also asked about his endorsement of hydroxychloroquine. He responded, you have hydroxychloroquine. I think it's going to be very exciting. I think it could be a game changer. A lot of good things have come out about it. A gift from heaven. So this is a real strong pitch for hydroxychloroquine. And this kind of behavior influenced the FDA to basically warrant it as a treatment for COVID. And then when they finally got enough pressure on 2 months later, they withdrew that warranty. So there's lots of things you can say in management, but I think that I like this stuff by Rudyard Kipling here. And it's called, I keep 6 honest serving men. So I think this gives you the beginning of what you need for any kind of management analysis. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So with that, we're open for questions. Are you there, Dave?
Yeah, I'm here. That's that was so good, Tom. Thank you so much. So we've had a number of good questions coming through. Let me go ahead. Let me start with this one, and it's probably a little controversial, but question is, what do you view as the major difference between the Trump and the Biden administrations when it comes to all of this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that I've thought about that for a while. So I think that basically there's 2 elements. One is the element of how do you value truth? And the other element is, how do you value science? I think that there's tons of data that truth was a real problem for the Trump administration, not just at the top, but all throughout the administration. It was a very serious problem, and like it wasn't an important question about truth, so it wasn't valued highly. Whereas I believe we're going to see truth is valued very highly by the Biden administration. That's one. The other is science. The president is known for basically telling people that he was the smartest general that has ever been there. He's the smart. He knows more about this medicine than the doctors do. He knows more about science. So anyway, he basically has no need for all those other inputs. So I think that what happens if you basically just live in a delusional world where you don't have the need for strong inputs from other people, what happens is you make a lot of mistakes that need not be made. Now, let me say this, that no matter who runs anything, there are going to be a lot of mistakes because it's a complicated world and mistakes are going to be part of it. But so the issue isn't whether you don't have any mistakes. No, you're going to have mistakes, but the number of mistakes, you want to keep them small. The seriousness of the mistakes, you want to make sure they're small also. So those are the two issues that I would basically say are different: truth and the need for science.
Okay, very good. So we've had a number of sort of back forth around the mask issue. We had a question, a comment actually about the masks, and Rhodey had mentioned that Fauci originally was trying to save the face masks for the hospital workers. And then Sarah says, even after the CDC reversed course and endorsed face masks, they made the ridiculous claim that masks protected only others, not the wearers. It flies in the face of all common sense and was easily debunked by lab experiments that showed masks also protect the wearer with varying efficacy, depending on the material of the mask. And so then the question is, why is there no mechanism in the US to hold those entities responsible whose behavior statements will lead to over 400,000 avoidable deaths? So kind of question about masks and then question about accountability.
Well,
400,000 plus.
Let's do the easy stuff first, the science of it, okay? The science has been obvious from the beginning, and it's just the way you stated it. So the questionnaires are asking the right question. It's sure, masks protect you from whatever's coming out of someone else, and they protect someone else from whatever's coming out of you. So it's a two-way street. So the benefit is clearly both ways. Now, why did CDC have so much trouble? I think what happens is organizations follow their leadership. And I think if there's not a strong commitment to truth in an organization, that truth gets pushed by the wayside. Now, if you don't have a concept of truth, I think that what happens is any answer that you want is fine. You just make up the answer and you say, that's it. So I think that was the kind of sloppiness they were getting into. So I think what happened is CDC was getting sloppy. They were getting pressured all the time. The director saying he was on the verge of resigning several times. So I think what happened is we basically had a system where you were supposed to be like a marionette, like a puppet on the string, and respond to the pulls of the string, as opposed to responding in a professional way. Now, hopefully that's been changed. So far, the people seem to be pretty vocal about what they think, which is good. And I think we'll all benefit from that. So there's some damage repair that's going to have to be done with CDC and FDA in order to get them back to where they should be. So I hope that can be done quickly. They have a new set of leadership in both places, and hopefully the new leaders are good enough to do it.
Okay, excellent. So Mary Dell had asked, if plastics are bad for the planet, why is there still so much of it being sold?
Great question. it's the question, I think, for environmental management. And that is that if you essentially don't put a value on the damage that's done by something, then that's a subsidy for the company. So basically, we haven't been charging them a proper amount of money to get the plastics recycled. And so if we want to use plastics, and we want to do it responsibly, we're going to have to figure out a way to basically include the recycling idea in the price of the plastics. Now, what will happen if you do that is some plastics will become unbuyable, essentially. And so that'll change the market, and you'll use other things other than plastics. But that's the key in general to environmental economics, is you have to basically look at the whole life cycle of whatever it is that you're using. And if you don't include the costs, okay, for example, like when we emit CO2 in the air, and people die from the particulate, from the mercury, from whatever, we don't include that in the price of our electricity. So if it's not included in that, what happens is the companies aren't going to pay attention to it. So we had an example with EPA where I believe it was Con Edison in New York. What they did is they were trying to just make electricity. So they were spewing out all this sulfur dioxide and particulate matter in downtown Manhattan. And they were violating the standards all the time. So they were being fined $1,000 a day. And they just put that into the books for how you run the company. It's just the normal cost of business. So they had no intention of fixing it. So people started asking, what if you charge $10,000 a day? What if you charge $20,000 a day? So they picked some numbers in that range. And all of a sudden, Con Ed fixed the problem overnight. So these things can be solved, but you have to basically do something clever in order to get them solved.
Okay, and then we had a question a bit ago about, actually Mark mentioned that something came out yesterday about the Pfizer vaccine saying that was going to be effective for 6 months. And so the question is, do you have any comment or thoughts on that? He's saying, well, he's hoping that it's at least a year. We've got these issues about boosters. And it sort of led me to ask a follow-on about it, which is that I've heard that the amount of flu cases reported have dropped with COVID. I don't know if that's true or not. But if so, is there anything to the idea that we'd have an annual COVID vaccine that might also kind of cover flu, since it's a COVID type of a disease?
Well, let's do the easy part first. I always like to pick the low-hanging fruit. The easy part is the decrease in flus. What happens when you have all these people running around with these masks over their face?
Exactly.
What does that do to the flu spreading?
Right.
It basically, a lot of that
Right.
flu stuff gets stuck in the mask.
Right.
And so what happens is it's harder for the flu bugs to spread. And so there was a giant drop off in flu. And I think that was a big surprise for most people.
Yeah.
So that's the easy part. Now the first part, what's the first part again?
Well, the first part is about the 6-month window effectiveness for the Pfizer vaccine that came out. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't seen that at all. But whenever you have something new, you really don't know some of the answers. You can basically say, does the thing work? Does it do what it's supposed to do? You can test that. And you can test, the idea of, does it do any harm? You can test that. So those are the two things they actually test for. Now, how long is the benefit? They basically don't know. So I think that it's like, we hope it's a long time.
Right.
And so is Pfizer now saying 6 months? Is that what?
That's what they said. Yeah, they said that yesterday. So.
Okay, so if it's 6 months, what that means is you better ramp up these vaccine centers.
Yeah.
And, keep them working longer than you were planning to.
Yeah. Plus the variants, plus everything else, right? We got to we have to deal with. Nina just put a comment in that said there are longer T cell benefits than neutralizing antibodies.
Okay, I want to put her on speaker. Maybe we'll get some
Nina, do
benefits.
you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, neutralizing antibodies decline over time, but the program built into the T cells and B cells is much more durable. So, I mean, you're not going to lose everything, and there are going to be variants, but
Right.
yeah.
So you're saying the vaccines will be likely pretty effective even against variants.
No, they will have some benefit. Any
Some
vaccine
benefit.
you take, I mean,
Yeah.
we get benefits from, if we travel, we've had hepatitis A and B and, you know, whatever vaccines are required for a particular area. And every single vaccine we take, whether it's for shingles or pneumonia or whatever, they help our immune system because
Right.
there's little bits of things that actually do interact.
Okay, so your immune system is sitting there doing its best to defend you.
Mhm.
And if you give it a little help every now and then,
That's good
it
point.
helps the whole system.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. Now,
Yeah.
it's good that you get some benefits that are longer with, like you say, T cells. That's a benefit. But I think, you basically, it's all risk benefit when you look at this stuff. And it's like, okay, is 6 months better than 0?
Exactly.
I'd like it to be 2 years, but I'll take 6 months.
Well, and Larry just clarified in the chat too that the report said it was at least 6 months. So it could be longer, as Larry is what you're saying. Right? Okay. So that's a good clarification. Yeah.
Yeah, they haven't tested it for longer than 6 months.
Right.
So
Exactly.
at 6 months, it's still working.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So it could be longer.
Okay.
Then
So
that's a different spin than what maybe I heard kind of what you said, Mark, and I think it got misreported then in some cases. So thanks for that clarification, Larry.
So basically, the scientists are going to tell you that this is what we can tell you.
Yeah.
If we've been playing with this thing for 6 months, we don't make any comments about a year.
Yes.
We hope.
And by the way, before we go any further, we're going to stick around for another 15, 20 minutes for anybody that wants to. But for those of you that are needing to run, we appreciate your being on not only this call, but if you've been able to join us for all of the 8 sessions here. We hope you've really enjoyed them. I know we all really appreciate the work that Tom has done in putting this together, and I'm sure we're all going to give him our own virtual hand clap and send them an email, if you will, and tell them what you liked about it and any comments. And then, as he said, any feedback and what you would like to see more about in the future, I think would be great. And
don't forget, we're going to have next week.
Next week there is this one more sort of an auxiliary session, and
we're going to talk about the grid and also how to Bill Gates's traveling wave reactor. Is this the answer to all our prayers?
Right. So it'll be the same Zoom link, same registration, so you don't have to re-register anything. Just come on in the same link, same time frame. So anyway, thanks again, and then for anybody else that wants to stick around, we'll keep going with Q&A and discussions. So let's see, where are we with our questions? We've had okay, Mark's asking here, will we need to get a vaccine immunity level test to see when we need another vaccine dose? Yeah, it hasn't been around for over 6 months, so can't test for any longer effect than that. So I guess we've kind of talked about that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There is something interesting that I've heard about, and that is that they're just starting to find out that people who have had COVID, sometimes there's things that sort of linger from the COVID. It's sort of stuck in your system.
Yeah.
And what they're reporting, this is early information, is that if you get a COVID shot, even though you've been, through the COVID routine, it does seem to help some of these people. So there may be some benefits there for people that are having sort of longer term issues.
think just looking back to see if we've gotten everything that was asked prior before anybody else may have some new questions. Did we get everything? Um, did we miss anything? Anybody?
I pointed out that Czechia was one of the worst countries in the world, the worst country in the world. It's apparently very badly run, and it has the Kent variant, the B117 from England, and they just aren't doing a very good job. Now, Hungary has just slipped up on the statistical compared to the Johns Hopkins, which is different, the one I read every day, but Statista slipped Hungary, and they must be having a sudden up run in the last 7 days or something.
Interesting.
No, I think it's apparently it's a touchy thing, you know. I mean, we do appear to be making progress, but then there's these dangerous variants that are lurking out there. In some places, those variants are taking off like wildfire.
California, for example,
Yeah.
the 427 and the 429.
So the uptake in California was due to the variants?
I don't know that. But
Okay.
definitely it's more transmissible. All of the new variants are more transmissible, seemingly. I mean, all the ones you hear about it. You know,
And
whether
yet those of us in Orange County just today or yesterday entered into the next tier, right? The orange tier, next one down. I'm not sure if San Diego is there yet or not. I think I heard April 6th it's supposed to drop into the orange tier, maybe. I think so. In San
Yeah,
Diego.
I don't really track that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. That just has to do with restaurants opening up and movie theaters opening up, and so we can expect to see probably some increases happening if people don't continue to wear the masks and maintain effective social distancing.
We're having some. Oh, I'm sorry, Nina.
I have an experience. I think it was Mark O'Connell was saying he got into trouble because he was wearing a mask. I mostly find people not wearing masks, but around where I live, which is old people. But I don't find anybody bothers me because I'm wearing a mask. But if I gave them a hard time about their mask, I'm pretty sure they would bother me. But that's just my personal experience living in an over 55 community.
Right.
Where do you live?
Leisure World. It's in Seal Beach.
Okay.
And
We live in Wesley Palms, and when people go for a walk here, they all have masks on.
Wesley Palms, that sounds faintly Methodist, is it?
It was a Methodist organization, and they ran it for 10 or 15 years, and then they went broke.
Is
And
it
so,
Claremont? No, I guess not.
Yeah. Anybody else have a comment, question? I see we're getting more of you popping up on the screen. It's always nice to see. Good to see everybody's faces. Mark, did you had an incident in the store, didn't you?
More than one.
Yeah.
More than one. And here in Irvine, I had not a lot of help from management. They're all like afraid to confront people or to enforce Irvine's own mask laws. So
Right.
I have like zero tolerance for those chin diaper people, I call them, you know. So, I mean, they just opened the gym here I used to go to, LA Fitness, and my wife stuck her head in yesterday, said half the people were wearing chin diapers in there. And so there's no way I'm going back there, even though I've got my vaccine, you know.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Good luck trying to talk to management. They'll just ignore you, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And the city of Irvine is just a toothless tiger. They actually went in one store, Sprouts, I think, and you know, gave a talking to about the, you know, making people wear masks in there, but you know, I didn't hear anything more. But
Yeah.
so that's funny. Some places it's like wearing a mask is no big deal. In other places it's really big deal.
Right. Yeah.
Hi, Tom.
Well, I'm Carolyn Harris. I'm also in the retirement community run by the same organization that Wesley Palms is, the Front Porch. But we are also guided by the Pasadena Health Department, which has its own health department the city of Pasadena, even though we're part of Los Angeles County. So our director has become very much frustrated because the Pasadena City Health Department is much more strict about the rules and regulations than LA County. And the Pasadena Health Department finally told her, stop people from calling us, because she had said, "You don't like the rules, call the Pasadena Health Department." So a lot of people did. But I find, I mean, I've got my mask here. I'm not in my own apartment right now because my husband's also doing a Zoom program. So I said, well, I would go up to the 5th floor. And so I'm the only one in this room right now. Nobody is coming in and using it. But I'm perfectly fine with keeping my mask. And one observation that I think is interesting is that I have not had any kind of cold or infection in the last 13 months since I started wearing the mask. And I think that, you know, we have to realize that it has made a difference in people's lives. So I have been in terms of respiratory, those types of problems, I have had nothing in 13 months.
It would be fun to see someone do an epidemiological study of, you know, the COVID mask as a cure for the common cold.
Not the common cold. I have not had a common cold. I normally have a pretty good immune system vis-a-vis the common cold. And because I worked with children aged 2 to 5 for, well, 31 years.
Okay, so you've been exposed to everything out there.
Could have been.
Yeah, we used to, in EPA, we would always look at the data, you know, and then whenever schools came back in from the summer, there's always a surge in all kinds of diseases.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
For a couple of years I was sick.
Can I speak about Wesley Palms, please? Am I unmuted?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
I am a resident of Wesley Palms,
Uh-huh.
and the full occupancy would be about 300 people here. There's a lot of land around here, and it's beautifully planted with walking trails. And the administration here is guided by the San Diego County Social Department, and they set the limits according to the state. And all I can say is that Wesley Palm has been on top of everything. They've had a lot of activities for us, but we're still wearing masks. I've had the vaccine, I've had everything. I've had not a symptom anyplace. But when we leave our residence, we still put on the mask. Yep. And so it's been for me, a very safe place to be. And I really appreciate that. It may have dampened my freedom a bit, but I appreciate the safety. So it's going well.
I should send a copy of this talk to Ben Yetzke so that he feels good about it.
Who is that?
The director of Wesley Palms. He would love to hear your comments.
Yes, we're one of the front porch people.
No, we are too.
And I'm very pleased with the safety here.
Well, that's excellent. Okay, well, does anybody else have any final comments before we let everybody go?
I do.
Okay.
I'm Walt Pankratz, and appreciate very much Tom's lectures. They've been very helpful. There's one question I wanted to request that he cover some if it's in his capability, and that is we have the interruptible sources of energy, wind and solar, that seem to be the coming thing, but yet we don't have sufficient storage of power, especially in the high megawatts capability. And this comes out in Bill Gates' recent book, and he says we're really dependent on developing new sources of extended power. And I've talked to Tom before, I think a year ago, about the fact that the tides work continually. So that seems to me to be a more feasible source of wave energy than wind and solar. Anyway, those are my comments.
Well, that's a great plug for next week's talk, Walt.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, because that's exactly what we're going to basically talk about. You got this crazy situation, where the photovoltaics doesn't work too well whenever the sun's down.
Yeah.
So join us next week.
Yeah,
Sure.
and then you have wind, which is sort of a intermittent kind of thing. So how do you put together a big grid of stuff that takes those intermittent sources and makes them work? That's exactly what next week's talk is going to be about.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to go ahead and wish everybody a good day. Thank you again for joining. Thank you, Tom, for another excellent presentation. And for those of you that care to join us next week, we'll see you then. And again, if anybody wants a copy of a video, please send me an email to any session that you didn't get and you'd like a copy of, and I'll be happy to send you the link. Dave Rice1 at Cox.net.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.